During the funeral of Darren Shan, a teenage lad, everyone is heartbroken by his death, but it turns out that he is still alive. In fact, he is shown playing video games inside the coffin. The scene then shifts to the past as Darren describes how well his life was going. His parents were pleased with him since he was popular at school, had nice friends, and got high marks. Steve, his boyhood closest buddy, was the sole unpleasant aspect of his life. Steve persuades Darren to skip their history lesson one day at school. The two then proceed to the rooftop, where Steve breaks many light bulbs with stones. He then challenges his friend to do the same, but their history instructor overhears the disturbance from the roof just in time. As a consequence, the boys are apprehended and their individual parents are notified. Darren fared the worst, since his parents had always thought of him as a model student. They scolded him harshly and grounded him for 2 months. They also banned him from remaining friends with Steve, claiming him as a detrimental influence. The next day, on his way to school, Darren informs Steve that his parents have asked him to stop their friendship. When Darren hears this, he becomes depressed and accuses him of never sticking up for himself. A limousine drives by while they argue, and a man inside throws out a flyer, which drops in front of them. It turns out to be an invitation to a freak show, a circus performance. According to the flyer, it occurs once every 500 years. The guys recollect their instructor cautioning them against visiting the circus due to its unlawful nature, but they nevertheless decide to go. Later that night, Darren and Steve sneak out of their houses and ride their bicycles to the circus. The lads' odd hobbies are exposed. Darren adores spiders, whilst Steve is infatuated with vampires. They purchase a ticket from a dwarf human-like creature lurking behind a curtain at the arena. When Steve offers it the money, the monster bites his hand and flees. The lads dismiss the weird encounter and enter the theatre. It has been reported that the show has drawn individuals of various ages, primarily adults and the elderly. Soon, the play begins and Mr. Tall takes the stage. He greets the audience for attending before presenting them with a number of weird misfits. At first, a wolfman arrives, frightening everyone. Mr. Tall points him at a woman in the audience, and to everyone's surprise, the wolfman rips her hands off. Before anyone can say anything, the woman's hand regenerates, and she goes towards the stage as if nothing had occurred. Mr. Tall then introduces her as Corma Limbs, a freak show performer. Alexander Ribs, a guy with no visible ribs, is up next. Gertha Teeth is the third member, and her powerful teeth can smash almost anything. Her mate, Ramus Two Bellies, can devour anything owing to his 2 bellies. He even consumes and spits out a tricycle in one piece. Then, on stage, a gorgeous freak named Madame Truska summons Darren and begs him to be her assistant. When she touches his face, she detects something prohibited within him and backs away. Madame Truska continues the show by surprising the audience by developing facial hair in an instant. However, following her performance, she surprisingly requests that the program be cancelled. Larton Crespley, the following performer, takes the stage with his spider companion Octa against her request. He wows the audience with a dancing performance while playing an instrument. Steve knows Larton from a vampire book and tells Darren that he is a vampire named Ver Hoston. The presentation is then stopped by police and local residents, including the lad's history teacher. While the grown-ups dispute, Darren slips backstage and snatches Octa, drawn to its vibrant appeal. When someone enters the room, he is compelled to conceal while he tries to escape. Larton, to his astonishment, appears with an old man. Addressing the threat posed by the Vampanese, a gang of hybrid vampires. Steve storms in and asks them to transform him into a vampire. He claims that he despises his life since he is alone. Steve's father went missing a long time ago, and his mother is a drinker. Lawton ultimately caves after much persuasion and agrees to taste his blood. However, as soon as he places it in his mouth, he understands Steve is a nasty guy. As a result, he refuses to transform the child into a vampire, causing him to stomp out in rage. Lawton eventually discovers that his spider has gone missing, but before he can check the door, Darren freaked out and flees. He then arrives at the road and gets picked up by the same automobile from previously. Inside, two guys, Merlot and Mr. Tiny, begin questioning him. However, it quickly becomes clear that they chose the incorrect kid. They were hunting for his pal, Steve, so they leave Darren off at his place, but not before telling him that they will contact him later. The next day, Darren transports Octa to school in his suitcase in the hopes of keeping her safe. However, Steve notices them before the lesson even begins. He begins to play with the spider and inadvertently drops her on the floor, allowing her to escape. Instead of attempting to capture the spider, Steve pursues her with the aim to kill, generating a ruckus in the school hallways. Many students flee in terror and some are harmed. Octa has had enough and decides to strike, biting Steve on the cheek before fleeing through the window. As a result of the poison, the latter falls to the ground and is struck unconscious. Darren goes back to the circus and begs Lawton to save his friend's life. Lawton first refuses to assist because he is concerned about the consequences of a human discovering their presence. However, he finally offers to supply the antidote on the condition that Darren become his vampire assistant. This means he'll have to leave behind his family, friends, and whole social life. Darren will also be unable to attend school. In a nutshell, he will have to die. Despite the severe consequences, Darren, anxious to rescue his friend, complies to the terms and accepts Lawton's vampire blood. They then rush to the hospital to save Steve's life. Lawton promptly gives the antidote, which thankfully works, and Steve begins to recover. Darren begins to feel his body reacting to Lawton's vampire blood a few days later. He develops a taste for raw flesh. He also has a strong desire to murder and drink his sister's blood one day. However, he eventually overcomes his bloodlust and returns to his chamber. He discovers Lawton in the corner reading his books. Lawton advises Darren to leave his house, since he is a danger to himself and his family. Darren does not want to go, but after nearly injuring his own sister, he resolves to do so. However, he does not want his parents to be concerned about him indefinitely, so he chooses to fake his death. Later that night, on the house's rooftop, Lawton aids Darren by breaking his neck. This will lead everyone to assume that he died by accident. The film then jumps to the present. All of Darren's friends, teachers, and family attend his burial. Despite the fact that Darren is still alive and well inside the casket, playing games on his phone, Lawton digs up the grave and frees Darren from the coffin the same night. Merlot appears out of nowhere and ambushes them before they can go. Fortunately, Lawton fights him off and momentarily subdues him. He takes Darren to the freak show campsite after the close incident, where they encounter a girl named Rebecca. Meanwhile, Steve is devastated by the loss of his friend. As a result, he withdraws from society and becomes a crazy. When the anguish gets overwhelming, he considers suicide. Mr. Tiny appears and stops him just as he is ready to do the unimaginable. He adds being aware of Steve's sad life and his infatuation with vampires. He then gives him the opportunity to become a Vampanese. Tiny and Merlot are Vampanese, a separate breed of vampires that, unlike Lawton and the others, murder people in order to feed on their blood. It's also revealed that Vampanese and the other vampires are arch adversaries who don't get along. Mr. Tiny reveals something even more unexpected as Steve listens in bewilderment. He claims that Darren is alive and well in the other world. something Steve had always wished for and desired to be. The discovery enrages the latter, so he takes the offer without hesitation. Meanwhile, Darren gradually becomes at ease at the Freak's campsite with the other Freaks. He begins to train himself and assists others in their responsibilities. One day, Darren is going through his old photos and decides to phone Steve. But before he can, Lawton appears, grabs the phone from Darren and smashes it. Mr. Tiny pays a visit to the Freak camp that night to speak with Lawton and Mr. Tool about Darren. Mr. Tiny requests that they hand over the youngster since he has extraordinary natural abilities. Despite the fact that they are adversaries, Mr. Tool kindly informs him that he would think about it. Following that, Lawton orders Darren not to leave the camp since it is no longer safe for him. He then starts training Darren so that he can handle himself if he ever gets into trouble. At first, the child is unable to lay a single hand on Lawton, but his abilities and strength improve as his training proceeds. Merlot, on the other side, transforms Steve into a Vampinese, giving him incredible powers. The youngster grows increasingly nasty, and his first victim is none other than his history instructor. Meanwhile, when Darren grows hungry, he develops a need for new blood. To make amends, Lawton transports him to a nearby farm and sedates a guy. He claims that vampires never murder individuals. Instead, they take their blood. Darren, despite his hunger, cannot bring himself to do it, so they return to camp. A troop of vicious Vampinese invades the Freaks' calm campsite soon after. Chaos follows as the two sides engage in a fierce struggle that results in significant bloodshed. The Vampinese are clearly looking for Darren, and they quickly discover him hiding inside a dressing room with Rebecca. The Vampinese assault Darren, resulting in a heated battle. But owing to the timely arrival of Lawton, Mr. Tool and the other Freaks, the battle is ultimately broken up, and Darren is spared from imminent death. When the dust settles, however, it is apparent that Merlot has kidnapped Rebecca. Darren rushes out to find her the next morning, blaming himself for the entire situation. Meanwhile, Mr. Tiny kidnaps his family in order to draw him into a trap. After some while, Darren returns home to find it vacant. He then spots a leaflet on the table inviting him to the circus. Meanwhile, Lawton decides to join the fight and grabs his weapons. Darren arrives at the circus, where he discovers Rebecca and his family chained and hanging on the wall. He is also perplexed to see Steve holding the Vampinese. Despite this, he strikes his erstwhile best buddy without hesitation, while Lawton comes and begins a fight with Merlot. Because Darren has not ingested any blood, he becomes extremely weak and easily bruised in comparison to Steve. But then Rebecca frees herself and asks Darren to swallow her blood in order for him to regain his vigor. He first resists, but after Rebecca tells him that she will be all right, he sucks her blood. Lawton is severely injured elsewhere, but despite this, he uses the last of his power to stab Merlot in the heart, killing him. Darren immediately starts fighting with Steve again as Mr. Tiny observes from a distance. He's had enough and decides to step in and stop them. Mr. Tiny uses his extraordinary abilities to resurrect Merlot by transforming him into a dwarf monster. He then invites the two lads to accompany him. Steve, astounded by his power, promptly obliges, but Darren does not. Following the fight, Lawton hypnotizes Darren's family, erasing their most recent memories. They won't recall the strange happenings that occurred directly in front of their eyes this way. The film concludes with Darren returning to the camp, where all of the Freaks greet him warmly and make him feel at home. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more videos.